Because in earnest, if we get the real numbers, which I'm very, very much thinking that we will not, based on what's happened already, will we get the real numbers for harvest? If we do, it's going to show a gargantuan, substantial, unbelievable, unthinkable, unfathomable decrease in global yields.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
So they changed the sign to say sometime in the future. But now I've noticed a really wide view of the number of years that they're getting you to look out at now. Suddenly it's multi-thousand years is pervading the headlines. Notice it when you do look through some of these stories that the wide view is suddenly being put out inside the media. And you wonder why. What's going on with that? You know, we had the red noctilucent clouds not too long ago. Usually they're blue. But the red and orange noctilucent clouds signaled something as well in the upper atmosphere. Now we have the smoke, Arctic burns. Now what I don't get here also is the strange sunsets. They're saying it's never happened before, these type of sunsets. It's because of the smoke, etc. Okay, I'll follow your storyline. But then how do they get Tambora, the year without a summer in 18, 15, 16, 17, 18, these massive amounts of crazy sunsets? After the year without a summer, Tambora erupts, equatorial eruption down in Indonesia, and the amount of paintings coming out for the next 4 or 5 years had the most electric colors that they have seen in paintings up to this day. So the sunsets witnessed after the Tambora eruption would eclipse this and make this look like a dog and pony show, really. I mean, the sunsets are beautiful. They're amazing. They're like this yellow halo glow coming out of the sunset with oranges. Well, if they say these types of sunsets have never seen before because of contaminants and smoke in the atmosphere, I just don't get it on how they keep focusing on the dust from this to say this is the first time it's happened, but they didn't even get the Tambora eruption. That wasn't even 200 years ago, 1815, and then the subsequent next 5 years to 1820, it's about 200. How could they miss such a thing and then put out this year 10,000 years when they missed something that was so close in 200 years ago? The sweltering Arctic is ablaze and unprecedented wildfires are ravaging the Arctic. The smoke and wildfires off the Arctic happen every year. It's a normal thing. Reindeer herders rely on this for their herds to get grass because it'll grow faster there, either at the end of the season if wildfires occur early, or it'll be the first place to show grass and emerge with new growth the following season, right? So let's say it burns right now and it's late, it's getting into August, probably not enough time for any new grass to emerge. But if this had done this in, like, say, June, there would be new grass. And this is the way it was explained to me in some articles I've been reading about how reindeer herders follow the fires because their herds will get the best nutrition the next year. I was chastised for not putting the wildfires in my North Pole analysis. I pointed out that even though they're screaming across the headlines here, wildfire hot, Arctic's ablaze. So I went to the temperatures in the actual Arctic maintained by the Danish Meteorological Institute from 80 degrees north to the North Pole. And I pointed out that the temperatures were not above normal. They're actually below normal or riding right at the line. So there's no anomalies for heating in the Arctic, really. Verified by science and the temperature data measurements. There's no anomalous heat in the Arctic. It's well within the averages well within. It's actually below average for the first part of the melt season. But because I didn't include the wildfire areas in the Arctic analysis, which is way down around, 65 north? They're like, see, you're trying to skew the data by showing only the Arctic temperatures. And I'm like, oh, I don't get it. Trying to skew the data by only showing the Arctic temperatures that they said was record hot, but it's not record hot because the Arctic's not record hot. Because I didn't include areas that are not in the Arctic. So if I didn't include areas in the Arctic that are not in the Arctic, but I talk about Arctic temperatures not being hot, somehow I was misleading people by not talking about Arctic temperatures because the Arctic's not hot. But I should have included something way down south. That's like saying, hey, man, it was record cold in Chicago, 2018-19 winter, like broke all the records back to the 1880s, but you didn't include Jamaican temperatures, dude. That's kind of the same attitude. Well, you didn't include the St. Lucia temperatures, man. Why didn't you do that? I don't know. It's in a different part of the world, I guess. And this is the insanity they're going into to protect the narrative. That's what I'm saying. Protect the narrative at all costs.
And speaking of cycles, my new book with my co-author Bill Porter, Climate Revolution, a must-read for understanding our sun-driven climate. As we progress deeper into this new Eddy Grand Solar Minimum, weather extremes leading to global food scarcity and higher food prices are here now. This book describes the expected changes, how to survive and thrive during future challenging times, and also practical preparations. The entire book is interactive with over 250 links, so you can click and go out to the scientific aspect of what we're talking about with the repeating cycles in this Grand Solar Minimum. The science is explained so you understand the mechanisms. The solutions are there because we know we're going to face these exact same problems again that were faced in the Maunder Minimum, the Sporer Minimum, the Wolf Minimum. Find designs for building greenhouses, grow guides, beam soil techniques, as well as bioreactors to create your own growth hormones for the soil. Available now, the new Adapt 2030 Climate Revolution. The link's in the description box below.
Shock. This came out this week too. A full 12% of all American farmers did not get their corn or anything into the ground this year. And 48% of these farmers expect below average yields this harvest. So again, we come back into, this is American survey. Now moving over to China, since even last week, they've had more floods that have decimated more crop growing areas. So China is very non-forthcoming with numbers. But now, how has that number crept up? In the beginning, they said they lost 30% of the crops due to the armyworm. They didn't count any flood damage in there, but if you would see the images from the floods, oh my, it looked like Oklahoma. It looked like the United States floods. So now the Chinese government is actually even really coming out saying that there could be a reduction of up to 35% of their crop due to armyworm and extreme weather. All right, so they're saying 35%, but if they're saying 35, it's way higher. Way higher. Now we had the flip-flop in temperatures, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, and suddenly, magically, they're downgrading the yield forecast for Russia and the Ural Mountains. How is that? Now, the record cold in Brazil that had swept through during the harvest season is also reduced in earnest now. They actually have numbers. They're not going to reach the record production that was forecast last month. They were saying Brazil's going to exceed by 100,000 tons extra. So they're not going to exceed that. You know why? Because the record cold reduced what was available and what was happening with the harvest. And because that record cold that was below freezing really stunted the growth. So everything stopped at that second. So what they had anticipated for an extra 3 weeks of growth didn't happen. So now instead of even having last year's production, they're below that last year's production. See, this is what I don't like about grain forecasting by the USDA and other agencies across the planet, because they're using optimal conditions from the prior year to forecast in the most horrendous conditions measured in 100 years for growth, instead of taking analysis on the ground looks and approaches to everything. So every single forecast that was given is really a moot point. They wasted the time in the paper to put it on. How can you possibly forecast using the prior year's numbers where things were normal, average, good, into something where they had the worst floods in 100 years, the least amount of planted acreage since 1938, decimated corn out of China, and reduced production out of Brazil. Yet they're still coming out in the Global Agricultural Survey saying the world's production is going to increase a full 3% this year. How's there such a disconnect in what's being told to the public on the food availability? They're going to have to draw down on what's stored in the world grain supplies. No ifs, ands, or buts. People are going to be needing to dig into what they call the carryover stocks, or those things in the silos. They're going to have to dig into that. Like, how many millions of tons are going to be pulled out this year? Will they be forthcoming with the number? Will they really tell you the truth on how much they pulled out of the silos? Will they be truthful with the actual yield numbers this year, tonnage-wise? Or will they fake a zero on that? Because in earnest, if we get the real numbers, which I'm very, very much thinking that we will not, based on what's happened already, will we get the real numbers for harvest? If we do, it's going to show a gargantuan, substantial, unbelievable, unthinkable, unfathomable decrease in global yields. Now, to offset that, they're going to have to dig into what was stored from last year. So what if we use half of the carryover stock just to make something equal this year? All eyes need to look to next planting season. Because if it was this bad this year, and they may very well dig half of the carryover stocks out, leaving us only half of the reserves we had this year. If we have a tumultuous and bad planting season next year again, and they dig into that, that gives us less than 3 years of global food supply before we're out of anything in the silos that's the carryover from the previous year. At that point, all we get is what we grow. And see, this is the whole point of the channel, to point these things out. So the hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, I'm really curious how the Ural Mountains harvest is going to come out this year. Because it'll be a good indication of how the hot and the cold coming so quickly to these crops is going to affect their yield and the height of the plant, the wheat specifically in the Urals. I watched the most amazing documentary on Joseph Stalin and Lenin and what happened in the grow zones during the flip when Stalin starved all of the farmers. Ukraine is where you're going to be focusing on. Ukraine used to be the biggest breadbasket in Russia at the time. That's why people don't want to annex it back again, because they understand what happened under Stalin. The breadbasket is there. What was talked about in this video was the reduction of yields higher in the northern climes, same areas, Ural Mountains, declined in production, so they turned to what is now the Ukraine for an increase in production. Things were fine. The economy started to boom again after Lenin. Stalin took over. Things were great. He let the farmers grow as much as they could, and that area in the Ukraine became the breadbasket. In terms of wheat output, Ukraine was the to-do all at the time. And we got to go back in the 1920s and 30s. But then the farmers became so wealthy because food. They had the famines before, during Lenin's time, and the collectivized farms under force and duress to grow food, that doesn't work either. They wouldn't grow the fields. They burned their houses down so the communists couldn't get it. So what did Stalin do? He's like, well, if you guys are going to resort to that kind of action, they sent the army in. They took all of their growing equipment away. They took all of the seed for next year to plant away. They took all the furniture out of the homes. They dismantled everything. They sent a lot of people up to the gulags in Siberia, and then they locked them in and let them starve in the food grow zones because they had nothing to farm with. And this was the retribution from Stalin to the farmers who would not grow food. I encourage you to take a look at that chapter of history. It was so stark, of almost a blueprint of what's happening today, but it showed you where the yields went offline back during Lenin's time. Now, this is very similar to what we see with the low solar activity and the high solar activity. Now take a look during the reign of Lenin and take a look at the solar cycles and see where the dips were, and you'll see where the famines were, where the crop production was greatly reduced during the solar low on the 11-year solar activity. But at that time, we were having what's called a centennial minimum. There's centennial minimums, the bicentennial minimum, which is a 200-year low, and there's a centennial minimum, which is the 100-year low. But that occurred right during Lenin's time. Now, they had the 100-year low in solar activity, and the grain production was diminished as well. Although you need to realize the world was very different at that time in terms of technology to grow food, because what had happened is after Lenin died and Stalin took over, he told the farmers to grow food. Now what they did is they started to buy up, if you will. So they were growing the grain, and that was the thing that was getting the foreign reserve into Russia at that time. That money the farmers were getting to export their grain was then, they're like, hey, we can get better machines and grow even more grain. We can increase our yields even higher. We can make money faster. So what they did was they started using that money that they would get and go buy Western foreign machinery that was better than what they had with the rudimentary animal-drawn plows that they had. Harvesting equipment was not modernized until they started buying, and their yields increased just by the efficiency gains on what was going on in the fields. Because it was shown that what was being grown, a lot of it was not being harvested or even brought to market because the loss of the actual harvest itself and processing. Like they could increase their gains by 15% by using a different kind of machine to sheath something. To get the kernels of wheat out of the actual plant head, thashing it or doing it with a wooden spindle was very inefficient comparatively to what the West had in terms of hooks to rip everything apart and get all the kernels out of there. So they got efficiency gains and yield gains just on switching machinery. But then they switched over to new plowing equipment. They switched over to the harvesting equipment. They switched over to the drying and the storage equipment, which gave them better yields. They also switched to new seed varieties, which gave them better yields in earnest and like what they could grow in the fields. Now, here's the interesting thing. So the grain production starts to ramp up greatly during the first years. Now, Stalin in the first years was like, farmers grow, we need to get the economy back. Everybody was in revolting anyway, Bolshevik revolutions going on. Because the farmers, and again, I encourage you to look at Bolshevik Revolution. Again, that's when it came down to Stalin starting to force people to grow food, and then they started revolting against the troops that were coming in and the overseers and the 25,000. It was like a group of people going out to collectivize farms and tell people what to do. They were called the 25,000. You can't force people to grow food. And that's truly what started their revolts. And after the revolts went on, Stalin realized he lost control of the grow zones, and he's like, you know what? I'm going to starve them all versus losing my food supply. And once they're all starved, there'll be nobody there next year. We'll come in with our own people and get people to grow food again. Was the mentality, and it happened. The amount of starvation that went on there was unbelievable. And it's so interesting that it was in a grow zone. Now, if that's the links people are going to curtail and make sure that they have their food grow zones under control, can you imagine the chess pieces being moved around the board today to assure control of food grow zones or emerging food grow zones? It takes us into the twilight zone. So again, if you're going to look at crop yields and what's happened in the past, specifically focused on politics and the way food was so integral to the moving and the evolution of a movement and a society, a culture, and a country, take a look at what happened after Lenin, the emergence of Stalin, and how they went into the Bolshevik Revolution with the food, and then they starved the farmers. You know, when you look at history, it's a possibility of what could go on in the future here. The case in point, and the last cherry on the cake on that story is, the farmers went from the most impoverished to the wealthiest of the society in just a matter of years, not decades, years. They went from being dirt poor, borderline malnutrition themselves, to the wealthy upper crust of the society in 5-6 years. And then when Stalin wanted to control the food, food control and when grow zones, he started to make movies about how bourgeois and how much money wasting the farmers because they're so rich that they're wasting all this money. And he showed these like 1930s US movies, like the speakeasies and roaring 1920s dancing and everything. People playing music and bottles of champagne opening, and the bourgeois, they're wasting our money, they're wasting your money. These dirty grain farmers are now they're rich, they're elitist, we got to get rid of them. Propaganda to remove the farmers because they were making too much money. Now this brings me right over to China, because the propagandist movement, understand China owns Hong Kong, Hong Kong's part of China. What they've done because of the unrest in China, since it's gotten so out of control in Hong Kong and the local autonomous government can't control it anymore, it's a harmonious society where everybody has buttercups and full bowls of rice. Awesome. And there's meat now too, so throw some pork on top, everybody happy. Jobs everywhere, Housing, look at the big cities that are built. It's a utopia. That's the message. Nightly. Has been forever. Never changed. They never showed discontent in the kingdom until now. So as we march forward, is it really that they care that much about Hong Kong? Or is it that they're trying to distract the masses from the rising food prices in the country and the crop losses this year? Because we're seeing a lot of this saber-rattling, weird story stuff around the world to try to get people not to look at the food pricing, but to look elsewhere.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.